Actually, we're going to start right now. Thank you all for. Did you enjoy your lunch? Was that delicious? That was that was pretty good. We got to thank all the wonderful little hands that put it all together so that we could enjoy it. Um, Before I start and we go into something else, I was just so thrilled and excited, and I started jumping up and down because somebody with us is here today who's somebody who I knew way back when her son was running for another office. And we had a wonderful Starbucks in Las Vegas. And she is with us today. She came back to New Mexico. She is no one else but the mother of our great governor of Nevada, Sandoval. Miss Gloria Sandoval is here with us today. She's from New Mexico, she's here, but it was so wonderful to see you again. And you know how honored and proud and happy and excited we are of your son, but clearly he didn't get there if it had not been for you. So thank you, Ms. Sandoval, and we really, really appreciate you being here with us today. Okay, so remember the cards, the cards the postcards that some of you have been wonderful in putting in? I forgot to tell you, there is a prize, and it is an iPad. So, see now everybody, I love it, I love it. I really failed to mention it because I wanted to win it, so I figure if nobody does it, but they reminded me, so I have to tell you. Please join us in sending those postcards, and who knows, you may walk away from here with a wonderful iPad. Okay, so to kick off the afternoon session, I'm going to ask Andrew Johnson to come in and talk to us. He is the Assistant Vice President, State Government Affairs of BNSF Railway, to join me on stage as he introduces our next speaker. With over 1,000 employees in New Mexico, BNSF Railway has a significant footprint in the land of enchantment and has generously donated close to $1 million to charities in New Mexico. We are so grateful for your support to this event. Please help me welcome Andrew. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Rosario. We are honored to have with us New Mexico Secretary of State Diana Duran. She is going to address this conference. Secretary Duran was a distinguished individual. She has a distinguished record in public service. Elected county clerk in 1988, Ms. Duran served 2 consecutive 2-year terms. In 1992, she was elected to the New Mexico State Senate, serving until the end of 2010, when she resigned after being elected Secretary of State. As a New Mexico State Senator, Ms. Duran led efforts to update the election code, as well as modernize and reform the electoral process. She pursued ways to cut wasteful spending and streamline government, eliminate red tape, and support small business growth, preserve our water resources, and improve education achievement. Secretary Duran is one of many talents in Governor Martinez's administration. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Secretary Duran.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Good afternoon. First, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. It's an honor for me to be here today and be a part of this conference. Jamie had mentioned to me early on this last week that he wanted me to speak to you all about the issue of growth of the Hispanic population and Hispanic influence, as well as what all of this means in the 2012 elections. So I will do my best to do that, but first I have to say that it's a welcome change to be in front of a group of people who, in my view, aren't necessarily expecting some standard answer to every major question on public policy. I love the idea that HLN is dedicated to research. That is to say, thinking outside of the box, not making assumptions that Hispanics are some kind of monolithic social, cultural, and demographic group whose membership thinks exactly the same across the board, across the nation, on every single issue. You'd be surprised, thank you. You'd be surprised to know how often I have confronted that particular notion, and I've had to disabuse people of the idea that we as Hispanics believe such and such. I had to face that over and over in my 18 years in the state Senate in New Mexico. I repeatedly had to balance my strongly ingrained belief system instilled by my Hispanic parents and grandparents and my own upbringing, education, and observations about the way the world works against the arguments of powerful politicians of differing viewpoints who tried repeatedly to pressure me into voting for things that I simply did not believe in. You would be surprised how often I felt alone, or maybe you wouldn't. We all know the statistics. At 50.5 million, Hispanics are the largest minority group in the United States, representing 16.3% of the population. Hispanics actually became the largest minority group in 2000, and the numbers have grown substantially since then. But what does this mean in terms of influence, in terms of elections, in terms of 2012? What is influence as measured merely in terms of ethnicity or by race? Should we even think in those terms? As you can probably tell from my remarks, I don't believe in that. Sure, anyone can go to any number of exit polls and any number of presidential, gubernatorial, senatorial, or congressional campaigns and elections and see how the racial or ethnic vote came out in each race. People do that all the time, and they reach conclusions about how such and such got X% of the black vote, or X% of the Hispanic vote, or the white female vote, and on and on and on. I guess that's where the question of influence comes in, and maybe these are all legitimate inquiries. But at the same time that I am proud of my Hispanic roots and my Hispanic heritage, I suppose as an American and as a New Mexican, some of the over-the-top emphasis on ethnicity or even race as a factor in voting, as a factor in influence, leaves me a little uncomfortable. Often repeated news clips and everyday expressions refer to diversity and our diverse society. We are a diverse nation and society, and certainly we in New Mexico are a diverse state. There is no denying that. But is diversity only derived from race, ethnicity, place of birth, country or origin, or things like religion, creed, and color? Is diversity only a matter of demographic characteristics, or is it more, substantially and substantively more? Does diversity include diversity of thought, of philosophy, of opinion, or worldview? I believe diversity includes all of these things. I do not believe that a group of 25 people, or 100 people for that matter, that includes one person from every single racial group, ethnic group, age group, gender, sexual orientation, income level, and educational level, but who all think the same on each issue, reflects any diversity at all. I know it is conventional wisdom to think that you have diversity if you get someone from every demographic group to form a commission or to constitute a board or even in the legislature. But in my view, that isn't so. Diversity of thought and opinion, freedom, liberty, freedom to choose your own positions on public policy questions of the day, that is the hallmark of true diversity. Thank you. And so it is with the question of influence. How do Hispanics have influence now or in the 2012 elections? Is it by voting as a bloc for one idea, candidate, party, or cause? Not in my view. It is by educating ourselves, getting involved, joining, volunteering, signing up, supporting, actively engaging ourselves in the process for the candidates, causes, parties, or ideas of our choosing. We are more powerful if our opinion and our voting strength is up for grabs. If our political influence can be leveraged through and by the power of ideas. I, for one, do not take Hispanic voters or any other part of the American political mosaic for granted. I don't believe in pigeonholing people or making assumptions. Neither should the media, nor any candidate, nor any party. Hispanics are as diverse in thought and action as virtually any other group in America. I am proud of that, and I am happy about that and optimistic for our future because of that. I see the Hispanic Leadership Network as a key part of maximizing Hispanic influence and leveraging our voting strength through the power of ideas, reason, reflection, and critical thinking. You are a welcome arrival on the scene and not a moment too soon. I thank you all for allowing me to be a part of your meeting, and I wish you all Godspeed in all your efforts to create a better America for all of us. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Secretary Duran and myself have something in common. Her cousin was the former treasurer of the United States under President Reagan. So we're very, very happy. Thank you so much. Okay, next thing. During our morning session, we clearly discussed three of the important issues for Hispanics: education, jobs, and small businesses. We heard some of the proposed solutions to the challenges we face, but how do we make those challenges, how do we meet those challenges? How influential are we, as Secretary Duran was speaking? As a voting bloc, how can we maximize our impact? Our next panel will address the growth of the Latino community and what it means to the 2012 presidential elections. Our very own Senator Norm Coleman will be moderating. He will be joined by Dan Judy and Luke France from the Resurgent Republic, an independent non-for-profit center-right organization dedicated to shaping the debate over the role of government. So please, let's join them at the panel over here. Thank you. I'm actually going to join them here. So, Senator, go ahead.
I'm ready to go, and it's interesting because after listening to the Secretary of State Duran, we talked about the forum and the network being dedicated to research, to understanding. This is a good panel because these are the folks who have done the research. And let me jump right in. You did some research in a number of target states. I'm going to go to the researchers first, and then we'll join the discussion. And I do want to engage the audience in the discussion. So this is not about hearing from experts. In the end, we want to hear from you. But let me set the stage by talking about what the research was, what some of the key findings are, and then we'll kind of raise some issues that both we will discuss and I would hope that you would discuss. Gentlemen, can you talk a little bit about the research?
Do you want to take the overall purpose?
Sure. What we did, I work for Ayers, McHenry & Associates, which is a Republican polling firm, and we work in conjunction with Resurgent Republic. And we sat down and we thought, what exactly can we do to kind of get a bead on Hispanic voters in some key swing states looking ahead to the 2012 election? So we went into Florida, New Mexico, and Colorado, and we did 400 interviews in each state, and just asked a variety of questions about the political environment, their own personal situation, a lot of questions about President Obama, and then a number of issue questions as well. And we got the results back of this survey, and I'm sitting there and I'm looking at them, and I was like, oh my gosh. Like I almost wanted to jump out of the window because the results aren't great for Republicans. When I thought about it, it shouldn't have come as a huge surprise, but the party has some significant problems with Hispanic voters. But then we started talking about it, and we thought, well, listen, George W. Bush won 44% of Hispanics nationwide in 2004. In 2008, John McCain only won 31% nationally, including 42% in Florida, 38% in Colorado, and only 30% in New Mexico. So what we're looking for is not for Republicans to win outright among Hispanics. It's to make progress and kind of rebuild some of that gap over the that's kind of opened up over the last 4 years. And we'll talk a lot more about specifics as we go forward. But really, as we're talking about this, I want to keep in mind, and it helps me so that I don't get too dismayed, but that we don't need to get to 50% plus one on every issue. We need to be in the game. Right now, we're not there, but there are encouraging signs of progress in the poll.
Another reason why this is so important is we talked earlier about now there's over 50 million Hispanics in the U.S. But when you break it down, you look at the battleground states. Pew did a survey study, and from 2004 to 2008, the percentage vote of the Hispanic population in the presidential election grew the most in New Mexico. It was up 9 points, from 32 to 41%. It was up 5 points in Colorado and Nevada. So it's not just California, it's not just Texas. These are significant battleground states. The 3 states that we did this survey in comprise 43 electoral votes in 2012. It's going to be significantly important to make progress, and there's some definite signs of opportunities where we can do so.
The Secretary of State made mention of this view, which is Washington view of the Hispanic community being this monolithic group. Can you talk a little bit about, since you were in 3 different states, interviewed a lot of people, talk a little bit about the differences in the battleground states and the different demographic communities?
The one thing that to start off sort of the overall political climate, but by a 2-to-1 margin in these states combined, where they're in common, is that they think the country's on the wrong track, which we did a survey in March of last year. It was a national survey, so it's not an exact comparison. But at that time, you only had 50% of Hispanics nationwide voters saying the country was on the wrong track. So in these states, it's a higher percentage, more than a year later. You look at just sort of the opportunities. Only 10%, roughly across the board in all 3 states, said that the opportunities now for Latinos and Hispanics in the U.S. are better than 2009. So I think that's important to know the broad political climate, but there are some distinct differences. Like the Senator mentioned and the Secretary Duran mentioned, it's not a monolithic group. The high percentage of Cuban Americans, for instance, in Florida, even the Puerto Ricans in Florida don't respond the same way as Puerto Ricans in the Northeast. In Colorado, you're more likely to see Hispanic families there that have been there for 3, 4, 5 generations, a little bit different than what you would find in New Mexico. So it is a disservice. Conservatives are doing a disservice in just putting it all into the same pile. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to.
Yeah, and the critical demographic differences among these 3 states is the national origin question. In Colorado and New Mexico, it's about 2/3 of Mexican descent. In Florida, it's all over the map. You've got about 1/4 that are Cuban, about 1/4 that are Puerto Rican, about 1/4 that are Mexican or South American kind of combined, and then the rest is filled out by Central American and kind of other areas. As a result, Florida in particular looks a lot different from the western states. On the one hand, you've got the Puerto Ricans who are more traditionally Democratic, what you would think of as kind of more traditionally Democratic, whereas the Cubans lean much more heavily towards what you would consider traditionally Republican. And I think if anybody had a chance to see any of the Republican debate last night, that's why you didn't exactly see the Republican candidates on stage jumping up and saying, "I'm for ending the embargo on Cuba." That's not that when you're running a Republican primary or a general election in Florida, Cuba is still a big deal. And that's an issue very specific to that state, but kind of indicative of how different these states are from one another.
I think one other point in differences in looking at opportunities, and we could talk about this further too, but when you look at New Mexico, we asked a question here, do Hispanic voters, do you think on the issue of education, is it more important to invest more money, that the problem basically is funding, or is it more important for reforms, parental empowerment, school choice reforms, things that have been talked about here? You had 44% of Hispanics in New Mexico say it's a higher priority for reforms. Again, when you go back to the metric of where are we plus 40, that is an issue where it was different than Colorado, and to a certain degree different than Florida. So it's a significant opportunity on that issue.
You had a chance to ask the voters in these key different battleground states as to what were the key issues, key concerns facing the Hispanic community. And I'm going to ask you one whether there was a difference between folks in those various states. But Roselle, I'll turn to you. Even before I see what the data is, just turning to you, what would you say are the key issues from your experience of concern to the Hispanic community?
I think that one of the most important issues, and we discussed that, was the education. That is very, very important. People come to this country to get educated. That's why my parents came here. They knew that if we had stayed in Mexico, we were not going to have the education that they believed it was important for us. So education is really important. Somehow, erroneously, the Democrats have taken that and have taken the Latino community and believe that by pouring more money into the education, that our children will be better served. And clearly, that is not the case across the United States. And it's no wonder that the results are what they are. And I could guarantee you that those same results, you will find them in other, throughout the United States. So education is very important. Clearly, unemployment right now, it is no wonder that the president is very concerned about his own unemployment. But clearly, for the Hispanic community, that is a huge concern. And we've already talked about that. We had a wonderful panel dealing with that specific issue. That is the most important thing, because if we don't have a job, how can we then feed our families? Very, very important. If we're not going to be able to create our own businesses, if we are hampered in those efforts, how are we going to feed our families? So I believe that those are the two most important issues to the Hispanic community, and I think your research.
Gentlemen, the former Secretary Treasurer of the United States says that the issues education and the economy, and the survey says?
Survey says economy. We ask.
We're in good company.
Yeah, exactly. One of the classic pollster questions is an open-ended question, which is, what do you think is the most important problem facing the country? We don't give people a list of options. We just want to know, top of mind, what's the most important problem? When the economy is doing fairly well, that question gets spread out. Right now, as bad as things are, 72% in Florida say the economy is the biggest issue, 69% in Colorado, 60% in New Mexico. And on that question, there's not a whole lot that really registers. Now, that's not to say that other issues aren't important, and education is certainly one of those. And another is immigration, and we're going to talk more about that. But just because an issue doesn't show up on this at the top of this list, I mean, the number 2 response in Florida was government spending and the deficit, and that was mentioned by 5% of respondents. So you can see how top of mind the economy is. And when we talked this morning about the unemployment rate, particularly among Hispanics, and just the horrible economic conditions, that's not a huge surprise. It's very in line with what we're seeing among all voters nationally.
And I think one other point to add here, too, is when you look at younger Hispanics, the point was made earlier, 35% of younger Hispanics, their unemployment rate. Juxtapose that with the fact that, every month, 50,000 Hispanics turn the age of 18. So you have just a significant demographic swing here of areas of opportunity where the Hispanic vote is typically younger than other minority votes. And the outreach, it sort of puts a map forward of how do you reach out to this community in better ways for conservatives. And so that's a very important point, I think, to make.
You had a chance to measure ideology, how Hispanics view themselves, conservative, liberal, moderate. And it's tough to see because we've got the lights on out here, but I'll ask the audience, how many in the audience believe that more Hispanics identify themselves as liberal rather than conservative? Okay. Few number of hands. How many think, well, the other way around, how many folks here think that Hispanics view themselves as more conservative than liberal? Larger number of hands. The answer is going to be the latter, conservative than liberal. But here's the question. How many, in New Mexico, you polled New Mexico, the difference between X number said they were conservative, Y number said they were liberal. How many folks here think that the spread between there being more conservative, people identifying themselves as conservatives, liberals, is more than 20%? Very few hands go. And the survey says
The
in New
survey
Mexico,
says 45 to 24% in New Mexico.
identifying themselves as conservative over
Conservative rather
liberal.
than liberal.
And in Florida,
In Florida,
Colorado?
it's 45 to 27, and in Colorado, 40 to 29. So those numbers are actually fairly comparable among the three states.
And yet the challenge is that in spite of the fact that folks in the Hispanic voters identify themselves overwhelmingly as conservative, talk to me about party identification and how that's reflected in the ballot.
There's always two sides of the coin on this issue. The hard question. So you have, I mean, it should come as no surprise for this conference to find that a majority of Hispanic voters ID with the Democrat Party. In our survey work, we've seen national surveys from anywhere from 50, 51%. Then you have anywhere from 15 to 20% saying Republican, and so you have about a 30% range of Hispanics identifying as independents or swing voters. And when you're putting together a map forward, how do we increase center-right organizations increase our appeal to these voters? It's those Hispanic swing voters. They're concerned about fiscal and pocketbook issues. And I'd go even as far as to say, you don't have to have the right answer on the immigration question, which is obviously a very challenge, to talk to these voters. If you're talking to them and you're not talking about the economy, there's a total disconnect. And it's really not serving well. So where we sort of see and can maybe take some comfort, maybe too much comfort in the fact that so many identify as a conservative, but their voting patterns obviously don't reflect that. On the flip side, Hispanics typically don't like to say that they're liberal, so that's the other side of the coin. But we definitely have to make improvements, and the more they see Governor Sandoval and Governor Martinez and Senator Rubio, and it just becomes much more important and a better inroad with the community.
Yeah, and to wrap some numbers around what Luke was talking about, I think, because one thing that's again that is striking about this survey is the ideology numbers compared to the party identification numbers. So in Florida, for example, we just said 45 to 27, they say they're conservative. But when you ask them what party they are, they say that they're Democrats by 30 to 26%. So that's pretty close, and the Republican number, like we were talking about earlier, is buoyed by that strong Cuban community. Now in Colorado, where they're conservative by 40 to 29%, they're Democrats 51 to 14%. In New Mexico, where they're conservative 45 to 24%, they are Democrats 57 to 18%. So the Republican Party clearly, and we'll talk about this a little more as we go forward, the Republican Party clearly has major, major problems. They're problems that can't be solved overnight. I mean, in Colorado, when 14% of the Hispanic voters say that they're Republicans, that's very troubling.
Before I turn to Rosario for a little bit of wisdom, and then to the audience, by the way,
Yes.
for wisdom, I just want to do one more kind of demographic framing. Elections are typically decided by independents, and that's true among all communities. As I looked at the data, President Obama has softer support among Hispanic independents, that group is up for grabs. Can you talk a little bit about that data?
So here's what, the good news. Where conservatives need to do better in the outreach and where it's a natural link is with Hispanic swing voters. Where President Obama is having the most challenging time amongst the Hispanic electorate is with Hispanic swing voters. The reason why there are opportunities for center-right candidates to do better in 2012 than 2008 is because President Obama is underperforming right now. And you see that in national numbers. The Gallup has him below 50% amongst Hispanic voters as far as his job approval rating. You see that in our data in Florida and New Mexico. He's down 11 points based upon, on our generic ballot test, based upon what he received the vote in 2008. he's left himself little room for error if he's going to repeat the support he received in 2008. And that is something that is an opportunity. When you look at the question of, do Hispanic voters, particularly independents, do they think that he has delivered or has not delivered on campaign promises? You have a majority of these independents saying he has not. So there's some softening there. And I don't know if you want to hit the leadership question, but this is something that follows along the same line.
Yeah, and this dovetails right into what we've seen in national data, that voters are frustrated with President Obama for a variety of reasons, but it's not all ideological. A lot of it is that he overpromised and has underdelivered. And I've heard it from Hispanic friends, and I'm sure y'all have all heard it too, who will say, he said that he was going to do these things for us, and he hasn't done any of it. And there's a lot of frustration. And so when you ask voters whether he's been a stronger or weaker leader than they expected, you've got majority saying that he's been weaker. And on this question, intensity is starting to favor the negative side. So you've got more people saying he's been much weaker than saying he's been much stronger. And that's a problem because it's a lot harder to change those much numbers. So as they start sinking down lower and lower into the much weaker leader, that's when he's got problems that's going to be hard for him to come back from.
We haven't mentioned the I word in this discussion, immigration. We see the data says that Hispanic voters are significantly more conservative than they are liberal. Yet on the other hand, we see that they identify themselves significantly more with the liberal Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. How much does, based on your data, and I'm going to turn to the panelists first, and then to Rosario, and then to the audience.
Right.
We want to deal with these issues. How much do you think the immigration debate plays into that mismatch between ideology and party identification?
I think it's really important because it's oftentimes the lens that Hispanic voters view the other issues through. Whether they say they're more concerned about the economy as their number one issue, but they hear the tone of the Hispanic, the voters hear the tone of the immigration debate. And conservatives don't always do a good job balancing the substance of a policy, or quite frankly, getting the right policy, and that's a tough challenge with how that is delivered. And that's where it's just as important to say, the Republican Party and conservatives in general should be welcoming of legal immigration. It just, of how it moves forward. I mean, getting that tone right is something where we oftentimes, and where the media and the left of center organizations like to highlight the missteps, and those are just get natural play.
I think it's important to say Tom Tancredo doesn't represent the Republican Party on immigration. His position is in the party's position.
And the problem is to kind of elaborate on that. That's a great example. And when you look at 2010, and there was this huge wave election for Republicans. You had a lot of Republican governors elected, a lot of Republican senators elected, and obviously a huge flip in the House. In Florida, you had Marco Rubio elected, Rick Scott elected governor. In New Mexico, you had Governor Martinez elected. In Nevada, you had Governor Sandoval. In Colorado, that trend was bucked. You had a Democrat win the Senate race by 48 to 46%, and you had a Democrat, John Hickenlooper, win the governor's race with just 51%. Now, that had surprised me because I went back to look at it because I remember Hickenlooper as winning big, and he did win big. He had 51%, whereas Tom Tancredo had 36 or 37%, and Dan Mays, who was the Republican on the ballot, had 11%. But that tells me that having somebody like Tom Tancredo out there, and not just to single him out, but I think in this instance, it poisoned the well for Republicans among Hispanics. And when you look at the data and you see that only 14% of Hispanics in Colorado identify themselves as Republicans, I think that strikes at the heart of our problem. Yeah. And it's a tone problem. It's also a policy problem. But as we'll see here in the data, but the bigger problem more than anything else is the tone. And when you have somebody like a Tom Tancredo in Colorado, you can see every other state goes Republican, but Colorado stays Democratic. And I think he has something to answer for there.
Yeah.
Rosario, any reflections on this?
Well, I think that this is something that I think collectively a lot of the Hispanics here know that. We know that. It's in our gut. We know when we hear a Republican express his views with rhetoric that is completely and totally uncalled for, we all cringe. We all do. It's like, this is not the way we're going to attract more Hispanics. This is the wrong way. The Hispanics, the vast majority of Hispanics have the same values that we do when it comes to looking at the way the economy and education and the small business and less regulation. We all agree with all of that. And yet when we hear some of this rhetoric that is really over the top, we all cringe. There is this like, oh man, please, this is not how we're going to get more Latinos to come and vote for us. You guys verify what we all feel, what we all know to be the case. Importantly, I think more than the tone, and we had, many of us worked for a president who got it, who understood it, who felt and made us feel completely and totally part of America. And we're hoping that the next president of the United States, because of his great experience, will do the same thing for us. So I'm going to, if it's okay with you, we're going to take the first Twitter question. Continue to tweet. We've been getting very, very good ones. This is coming from CSC Lorsmore. What is the best way for an ordinary voter to capitalize on their influence? Okay.
The simple response is to engage, to participate in the process. The same Pew survey that I cited earlier found that in 2008, 56% of registered voters, Hispanic registered voters, also voted in the primary process, the presidential primary process. That number is only going to get higher. 15%. 15%. I was surprised that it was 1 in 7 in essence. Said that they donated to a candidate. 1 in 7 said that they attended a political event or a campaign-related event. When you look at the increasing numbers of Hispanic voters, those numbers are going to increase, and just naturally given it. And I think that's just the first place to start, with civic involvement.
Excellent.
Yeah,
excellent.
And to add on to that, I would say get involved directly with candidates, particularly white candidates, who may not really know how to talk about these issues, who may be talking about them all wrong. And I think that it's good for them to have people talking into their ear and helping them understanding how to talk about these issues in a way that doesn't poison the well.
If I may just add one thing, politics is a business where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, meaning that if you get together with your friends and your relatives and others, if you amplify your voice, you can have a significantly greater impact than you might think you would have. And so it is in my business, the world belongs to those who show up. And the other thing that I always like to say is government's either do something to you or for you, but government is going to do something.
So you want it to be for you.
And so it is best to be involved and to have your voice heard, and I think it's very sage advice to help those who are in a position to have their voices heard, to educate them. It's critically important. It's in this business, you don't know everything, and so your voices can be very, very helpful.
Good. Let me take some call. Hold on one second, Frank. Okay. Let me see. Somebody in the back over there. Yeah, you, the one that's. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Amy Sanchez, and I'm a student at the University of New Mexico.
Yes.
And I was wondering, how did you guys, when you did these different surveys, how did you define Latinos and Hispanics? Because that's a question that we deal with in classes and stuff quite often. The other question or comment I had to make is, traditionally speaking, Hispanics tend to be Democrats because their families in New Mexico were Democrats to begin with. And that's one of the reasons why you see that trend a little more often, I think.
Okay.
I guess I'll answer the first part of that question, and Luke can answer the second part. The way we identify the Hispanic voters for the purposes of this survey was by using a targeted voter lists in each state of registered voters that are targeted and identified as being Hispanic. That is not enough, but it's a good start to get a good sample. What we did from then what we did from there was then asking them a series of questions, confirming that they were Hispanic, confirming their ethnic national origin, and then we also gave everybody in the survey an opportunity to take the survey in English or to take it in Spanish as well.
And I think you bring up a good point about how the the family upbringing and how that influences how they start to define the different parties. When you ask a generic ballot question, in this case, President Obama versus a generic Republican candidate, there's going to be a natural hesitancy, I think, amongst an Hispanic voter to associate themselves with just a generic Republican candidate because all they see is that label. Once that becomes an actual candidate, and once they start to engage and start to see the various types of policies they're supporting, I think you might see a little bit of shift there. But I think that's a very valid point.
If I can respond on a personal note to this issue, a little different perspective, but the same response. I'm Jewish. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I used to tell folks, and not jokingly, true, I never met either a Republican or a Lutheran until I went to college. There were none in my neighborhood. I never met any. My neighborhood is part of New York 9. It voted Republican for Congress just about 2 weeks ago. And it voted because of, in part, disaffection with the president in terms of his dealings with Israel. Very important part of it. And so in this instance, where you have a president who's made what, la promesa, has made the promise, right? And at one time, remember, had a majority in the Senate, and a veto-proof majority in the Senate, which he used to pass Obamacare, and used to pass an $800 billion stimulus, who had an overwhelming majority in the House, and was president of the United States, could have done anything, and never followed up on la promesa. So change is possible. I experienced it just recently. I was rather shocked, let me tell you, because I remember the old neighborhood.
Yeah.
Another interesting one other interesting point on party ID is that for decades, party ID was almost as stable as any other demographic point. And so when you would look at voters' party IDs, Republicans stayed Republicans, Democrats stayed Democrats, and everybody else stayed independents. That is not true anymore. And over the last several years especially, you see people bouncing around all the time. So I think that's starting to change. Kind of the people who are like, I'm a Democrat, I've always been a Democrat. Those people are becoming independents. Some independents are becoming Republicans, and vice versa.
And I think one of the important issues for us to remember is that Latinos tend to vote for the individual. That's why we have seen Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor Giuliani, Governor Bush, President Bush, Richard Riordan, people who are all Republicans, and yet they were elected with significant Latino support. So Latinos will vote for the right candidate, and I'm sure some of them voted for the new Republican Congress. Okay, one more question, way back over there with a white shirt.
Yeah, is it known to what extent the Republican Party's repudiation of the DREAM Act has disaffected Hispanic voters, especially in light of the panels and everybody else's emphasis on education?
Okay.
It has not been positive for us, and by us I mean Republicans. We did ask a question about that. What we do is we do what we call he said, she said questions, where we kind of give our side's best argument versus their side's best argument to kind of recreate the debate. The question we asked on kind of the DREAM Act requirements was, Congressman A says we should allow children of undocumented immigrants who have grown up in America to attain legal residency status if they complete college or serve in the U.S. military, because it's unfair to punish the children of undocumented immigrants. Congressman B says that granting legal status to any children of undocumented immigrants will just encourage more people to come to this country illegally and is unfair to immigrants who came here legally and are waiting their turn. Now, that's not an exact representation of the DREAM Act, but it takes in most of the tenets and kind of the overall point of it. Hispanic voters in all three states agree by 2-1 with Congressman A that these DREAM Act ideas are good ideas, and that's a problem for Republicans who are out there kind of hammering away at it, because it makes sense. It seems logical that if a young Hispanic person serves in the military, for example, they should have an opportunity to become a citizen. And that seems logical to a lot of Americans and to a lot of Hispanics. And that's an area where I think we need not just to say, no, 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 we can't do this. We need an alternative of our own.
And there's no reason to believe that we can't come up with that alternative. If you look at the K through 12 education issue, 44%, the stat that I mentioned earlier in New Mexico, supporting the conservative argument in that realm. That should be able to be replicated. That should give us hope in that, look, this is not an issue to run away from. It's an issue that's important. It's an issue that we need to engage the Hispanic electorate, on. But it's something that, I think too often we conservatives get into this mindset. Well, I don't have the perfect answers on all these questions, so I'm just not going to, I'm going to ignore it, or just put in a negative or opposing stance.
Right.
And there's just a different way to deal with that. Just one other little anecdote. On engaging the Hispanic electorate. Even Hispanic voters have seen in other survey work who listen or get most of their media from English-only news sources. It's usually about 30% to a third of Hispanic voters. They still say it's important to them for conservative organizations or organizations in general to do their messaging in Spanish media markets, in Spanish media. Because in essence, it's a sign of respect. Even though they might not be seeing those ads, it's something that shows a sign of respect, I think. It was my take on it, amongst the Hispanic electorate.
I tell you something. If my mom, who only spoke Spanish, spoke very little English, she watches the Hispanic stations. And if she came in and told me to vote for somebody, I was going to listen to my mom. So, okay, question over here. Wait for the microphone to come. And we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to go to the next panel.
Hi,
Okay.
my name is Barbara Carrasco, and I'm here from El Paso, Texas. You did surveys, but you excluded Texas, but we're used to. I want to refer to the DREAM Act. I think the Republican Party, I know the Republican Party doesn't get the message out there. What we should be reflecting on is not the children that they're not going to go to school or into the service, but we don't mention the approximately 1.6 million kids that the DREAM Act doesn't affect. It punishes those children. So the question we should be asking is, what about the remaining kids? We're supposed to be targeting 2.1 million children, and yet it's only 650,000. What about the remaining children that it doesn't help? So I think that would be a better approach rather than saying, well, no, 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 no.
Thank you.
We want to include everybody, be inclusive rather than excluding that amount.
Absolutely. And to make a quick point about Texas, you're right, we didn't survey Texas this time. But to be quite frank, if we don't, as a party, figure out a way to get right on some of these issues, 4 years from now, we may be sitting up here not saying, here's how we can win Florida and New Mexico and Colorado. We may be sitting up here saying, how do we not lose Texas? And that's what's at stake. That's why it's so important for us to get these issues right.
And even in the South, some of the highest percentage growth of Hispanic population is states like Georgia and Alabama and North Carolina. And as they become higher percentages become registered voters, higher percentages participate in the primary process. It's a total different ballgame.
Yeah.
And there is significant Hispanic growth in Worthington, Minnesota. Worthington, Minnesota. An article recently about one of the largest segments now of the school population in Worthington, Minnesota. So this really is a national issue, and we really do have to get it right. And I know that we are streaming this, and I hope that my colleagues in Congress and Senate, we have a good chance to show this to them so that they can hear and they can listen. It's worthwhile.
Thank you. We're calling it off right now. They're going to hang me out, but we'll wait for other questions. And people are here. Please engage them. I always look at the positive, and I think it gives us this information. The results of the survey really provide us with a path. And while it may not be a perfect path, I believe we're in the right track. And if with all of your efforts, and certainly with the leadership that is being shown here, I think that we will get it right. I thank you all. Thank the panel.
Thank you for having
you.
Jenny, come on over.
Hello again. again, everybody. Is everybody having a good time? Yes, good. How many of you would like to win an iPad? All right, good. Okay, one of the most effective ways to organize and activate your community is with a text messaging campaign. That's why we are launching Leaders in Action, Líderes en Acción, and we're going to organize neighborhoods, calls to Congress, and letters to editor. So please take your phone out right now. Everybody have a cell phone? Please take your cell phone out right now and text LEADERS, LEADERS, to 97180. I'll repeat that. Text the word LEADERS to 97180. As a member of the text messaging community, you will be the first to know of our upcoming events, including a special video that we will send to you tomorrow. To be the first to receive this special message of America's newest elected officials, text again LEADERS to 97180 now. If you do that, you will also be eligible to win the iPad, which we will be giving away tomorrow at the barbecue. Do I need to repeat? We have a question over there, yes? Number again, 97180. If you're on staff, you cannot do this. You will not be entered. Yes, sir. You refuse to text. Well, if you refuse to text, there's another way. We're giving out 2 iPads. So if you saw the jobs postcard that was on your seat, sign that postcard and put it in the box in the very back, and we will be picking one of the postcards and giving an iPad out for that as well. Some of you were asking the best ways to get involved and have your voice heard. We are going to be sending these. It's not just a gimmick. We're sending these to the president, to the White House, after this event is over. So anybody else have questions on the text campaign? Thank you very much, and we'll announce the winner at the barbecue. And now, Rosario.
This is so wonderful. Okay, so the next thing that we have is home ownership. Hispanics view buying a home as one of the benchmarks of success. Between 2000 and 2007, Hispanic home ownership grew by 47%, which outpaced the population growth, according to the U.S. Census. Regrettably, Hispanic homeowners have been the hardest hit during this housing market crisis. For the most part, Hispanics have also suffered because of lack of savings, multiple sources of income, and/or unstable income and no established credit. It certainly has made it incredibly difficult to qualify for a traditional loan. While we have come a long way, the American dream of home ownership has long escaped some in our community. So how do we change that? To lead us in this debate, we are joined by Michael Sullivan, who will be moderating the panel. Michael. Doug, thank you, Michael. Doug Holtz, from the president of the American Action Forum. Former U.S. Housing and Urban Secretary Alfonso Jackson, a very good friend of mine, thank you. Former Assembly Member Bob Pacheco. And we are very, very happy to have all of these fine gentlemen here. We are going to hear their wisdom.
Let's be clear, their wisdom, just so we all understand. George Mason wrote in the Virginia Declaration of Rights that people had inalienable rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Our founding fathers took the view that property, the ability to possess property, was fundamental to our rights as Americans, that you could not separate life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness from being able to own property, being able to be secure on property that was yours, not subject to seizure by others. We have so accepted that in our modern parlance that we refer to, achieving the American dream isn't, being rich, or, well, I guess it's being on television these days, but besides that, we talk about it in terms of owning a home. That's almost the foundational definition of achieving the American dream, is owning a home. And yet, unfortunately, what we find today is that, as was noted a moment ago, for many in the Hispanic community, that is a dream that is far from realized. We find that something like 75% of whites own homes, about 60% of Asians, but only 49% of Hispanics. Hopefully, over this next little bit of time that we have together, we can talk about not only perhaps the reasons why, what we can do to encourage more ownership. Folks who are home owners tend to be more able to be engaged in their community, more reasons to be engaged in their community, but also try to understand how this most recent financial crisis has affected home ownership in the Hispanic community. I would like to kick us off by visiting with Alfonso Jackson. You and I were chatting backstage a moment ago and noted that there were misconceptions about what led to the housing crisis and then its impact on the community.
Thank you very much. Let me first say that when President Bush became president, one of the things that he suggested is that we try to create as many new homeowners as we could, especially Black and Hispanic homeowners. At the time, Blacks and Hispanics were very close together in the process at about 42% home ownership. When we left, it was almost 50%. But what I think is so important to discuss is the serious trouble that the GSEs got in, and yet low and moderate income people get blamed for it. They were put in conservatorship for a reason. Now, they provided tremendous loans, but it's important to understand that that is not the real issue that created the problem for. It was basically those risky loans and risky market mortgages that they bought. And they bought them basically for the same reason that many of the banks bought them, because they were very profitable and they were making great money off of those. It's important to note also that when you talk about the defaults that occurs, it's basically in middle income home owners, not in low and moderate income. And that's a misnomer. I've heard that a great deal, even from us, many of us as Republicans. We keep talking about the loans were risky. Yes, they were. But the loans were basically made to people by the mortgage industry that was not sanctioned by the bank or the government. Whether you believe it or not, when I became secretary, I couldn't believe we were making loans over computers without ever seeing the real financial statement of the people that we were making loans to. That includes FHA. So I want you to understand that we don't want to get caught in the trap of believing that low and moderate income people, especially when we said those terms, Black and Hispanics, created this problem. They did not. The second point that I want to make is that we keep talking about the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act, what effect it had on the foreclosure crisis. Because that act has been in place since 1977 for banks to make loans to low and moderate income areas. Well, I can tell you that basically they did not. They did not make loans. And they too got caught up in the mortgage-backed security problem. That's why they had the problem that they did. So from my perspective, as I go around the country speaking, I want people to know that we can't keep blaming those persons without empirical data to show it. Probably later on in the panel, if asked a question, I will discuss some of the empirical data that we found. Studies have been made. So from my perspective, I think it's important to understand that the crises were coming. And the really first time that Fannie ever made a large number of low-income loans was 2004. After that, they really didn't meet any of the criteria that HUD set up for them. We began to waiver that, and we had so much pressure from Congress to do that. And let me emphasize this. We had pressure from Congress, both Republicans and Democrats. There was not basically a congressperson that Fannie and Freddie didn't own on the Housing Committee. And even though at the time I became secretary, the chairman was Republican, I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Why don't you go talk to Barney Franks?" I said, "You're the chairman." He says, "Well, Barney knows a lot more about housing than I do." Of course, it did me no good to talk to him.
Next, let's turn to Bob Pacheco. You and I were chatting about the problems with predatory lending. One thing that I found very fascinating in some research the past couple of weeks is you can take an Anglo and a Hispanic, fairly similar financials, and yet very often the Hispanics will have far worse loan terms, far worse interest rates and other things. What's driving that?
Well, the big thing that's driving it is the what they call the yield spread premiums. What happens is somebody goes out and is able to package a loan, and the higher the interest rate that they charge, or they can get the borrower to pay on their interest loan, the higher the commission that they will get. So this is a kickback thing that the mortgage companies will do, and what they will do is because they want the high yield loans more so than the low yield loans. So I mean, the prime borrower is going to resist any higher interest, and they'll go find somebody else if they won't give it to them. So, but the borrower who is unsophisticated, who has not had a lot of experience in dealing with real estate, maybe it's the first time buyer, maybe it's a young couple, maybe it's a Hispanic couple that don't really know too much about it. In many instances, the paperwork, I mean, it's difficult for an attorney to even understand all the terminology that goes on. I mean, the most common thing, people don't know the difference between a deed of trust and a deed. So, I mean, that's a very simple, basic part of a real estate transaction, and a lot of people still get confused over that. So you can see where that comes. Now, what happened in that term when things began to go bad? There was something that was called a NINA. It's a NINA loan. It's a no income, no asset loan. And that actually was created into law, but it was targeted at that time for people who are self-employed, who are well-to-do, who don't have to really qualify for loans. So they said, okay, well, we can make these loans for people that have the wherewithal to pay it. And so we don't need to get into in-depth study on their history and their credit history. But what they did is they turned that around and then began to apply it to those in the minority communities, primarily the Hispanics and blacks who applied for mortgage loans. And that played in together with the yield on the interest. So you had an opportunity for being able to package a loan now that you didn't have to ask for income or assets. All they were looking at was the value of the property. Well, when properties were going up in value, I mean, everybody, you've heard it all. You've heard all the stories. You know, you buy a house and then sell it a month later and make some money on it. That was the big thing. Well, so many people began to get caught up in that. One of the principal people that actually was very much involved in that could have put a stop to it but didn't, was Freddie Mac. And they were a principal player in this scheme. So in 2004, I think is when they began to realize something was wrong. But the comment was made when they were trying to put the stop to this, because I remember that the Bush administration did say something about there's something wrong with the way these loans are being packaged. And when they tried to get Freddie Mac and the administration, those that were involved in that, they said, no, we think everything's okay. They called it something like this. They said, it's pretty hard to get in front of a loaded train that has high profits and try to stop it. So it was a question of greed. There was a lot of money being paid out in commissions. So from 2004, they began to tighten it, but they continued all the way up to 2007, and that's when it began to hit. So all of it hit about that time. And the areas, of course, the biggest areas are California, Nevada, Florida, where a lot of those Hispanics were beginning to settle. And they didn't have the wherewithal to pay the loans. They weren't being given a loan on the basis of their ability to pay. They were just, because the property was valued at a certain rate, a certain amount, they went ahead and gave them the loan. So, and I hate to say this, but one of the culprits in this was the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Of all people, they, if anybody, should have been considerate of the fact that they were selling package loans to Hispanics who, and they could do it because they talked the language. They could tell them, that's a good deal. You know, get in the house, you have a house. How many Hispanic families don't want to have a home? That is their dream. They'll save. There's a story of this couple that saved $5,000, and they had come in from Mexico, and they were able to save the money. They were able to get in with a $5,000 payment. I wasn't a 20% down. It was just barely enough to get in. Well, it didn't take long. When the market went down, so did they. So there they go in their pickup with all their belongings, and then there was nothing left. So it's bad. It's bad. What created it was bad. What resulted from it is bad, and we are now beginning to suffer the consequences of it. And those package loans were then sold in the industry, and those in the financial industries were reaping the benefits. They would package them and resell them and resell them and resell them. We got them all throughout the U.S., and then some went overseas as well. So that's why we have the big problem now. When we have that big a problem, I guess the government decided they wanted to make some changes. So in comes the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform and Consumer Protection Act, a lot of words. And they say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to create oversight for the bigger financial institutions, the non-banking institutions, the illegal lending practices. We're going to go into and do all of that. But it creates a whole bunch of problems. And so it hasn't been thoroughly thought out in terms of its application. And the reason for that is because one of the requirements in the Dodd-Frank bill is that except for loans that are FHA, VA, or Fannie Mae, I guess, loans, those are excluded. The rest of the market is about, and they hold about 90% of the loans. So 10% of the loans, that's the market that hits the Hispanic, because they are the ones that usually cannot qualify. Well, what's going to happen now is the Dodd-Frank bill says these lenders now cannot package these loans together to sell them to a secondary market unless the borrower has put in 20% as a down payment. And if you don't get a borrower that pays 20%, then you have to retain a 5% amount of the mortgage in your balance sheet in order to make sure that you have enough resources in case something happens. So what's going to happen is the Hispanic market is kind of out of luck now. So now they can't buy because they need a 20% down. They bought before and they were sold a bill of goods because of how they could buy it. And so now it's in a bad situation. So, I mean, we don't see the rebound of the market now for 3 to 5 years at least, perhaps longer. But these lending practices are so bad that somebody, I think they knew it was coming, they saw the train coming, it was, like I said, loaded with a lot of goodies, and everybody wanted to share those goodies. And so that's kind of what happened. I mean, there's the legal implications on that. I mean, I've been involved in some of the things as well on the legal side of it, the foreclosures, the predatory lending. The predatory lending to some people is a good basis for a lawsuit, but many borrowers would sign documents that would say they didn't have the right to sue, that they had to, that they had to mediate it or had to have arbitration. So they eliminated their right to sue. So all the same people that were hooked on with all these bad mortgages, now a lot of them signed these papers that they didn't know what the heck they were signing, that said, now you can't litigate it. If you want, you can arbitrate it. Well, you know, if you don't know who the arbitrator is, you don't know what you're going to get. So anyway, for now, I guess that's it. There might be a lot more.
Doug, what's the impact on the Hispanic community, growing community, fast-growing community? My native state of Texas, all over this country, when we see what was actually now the majority in Texas, majority in many states, growing anyway in many states, when they aren't homeowners, when they don't have property of their own, what does that translate into for the state of our nation? What can we expect to start seeing happening politically and demographically?
Well, I think looking back, there's just clear and significant harm to Hispanics from the housing bubble and bust. The pieces you hear so much about are the enormous loss in wealth, the large foreclosure rates, and the fallout of the burst. But the second thing that goes with that is we have a housing construction industry which is absolutely at a standstill, and that's had a real big impact on Hispanics. And if you go back to the question you first posed, which is, what is the route to property? The route to property is a job and and economic growth and some of the things we've talked about earlier today. And I do not believe that we will see a significant rebound until we see better economic growth. People have to have a better financial future before they're going to start buying homes again. I think there are some other lessons as well, and in the interest of full disclosure, I was on a commission that the Congress created to investigate the financial crisis, and some of the things that came out of that were clear origination of loans that just should never have been made in the United States of America. I mean, we can assign a lot of blame, but these loans should never have happened. Going forward, there's the lending side of that, but there's also the financial literacy side of that, where it's important for people to have some understanding of the kinds of commitments they are making and the kinds of rights they are waiving when they sit at a table. And anyone who's been at a closing knows that it's one of the most mystifying experiences of your life, right? There's all these checks with large zeros on them and lots of signing, and no one knows what's going on. There's something wrong with that, and that needs to get fixed in some deep way. I think the other thing going forward is, yes, own a home. Yes, have a stake in your community. Yes, raise your family. But own some other things as well. Everything in the house is not a good investment strategy. That got lost for a while. And minority communities in particular were heavily one-asset families, only in the house, and they've been damaged tremendously as a result. So the kinds of things that I see happening are the real loss in wealth, setting back some of these families for perhaps a generation. This is a tremendous, this is a really horrendous event from that perspective.
Let me add something to what Doug said. I think it's very important to think about this. As an attorney, I didn't read all those pages. I didn't read them. Now, how do you expect a layperson to read all those papers? They put them before you, you sign them. And I think it's very important to understand everything that Bob said. I mean, I could only second that. It was a unique situation where greed took over, and those mortgage-backed securities were selling so fast that no one paid any attention to them. But I wanted to add something that I said before and Bob didn't say. When we went to President Bush and told him what was going on, he gave us the green light to try to act. But as I said earlier, it is difficult when you own, and I don't mean this literally, but when you own every congressperson sitting on the Housing Finance Committee. Fannie Mae had regional offices in every state in the country.
Yes, they did.
And every month they were giving a T, which they called it a T, for a congressman, Republican or Democrat. So there was no way. And I'd like to say this, which is very important. When I authorized OFEA, which is the Office of Finance, to do the in-depth analysis of Fannie Mae, we could not find a law firm in Washington, D.C. that could represent us. Because Fannie had every one of them under contract.
Wow.
At some form or another.
So I want to echo this. I think this is really important. I'm the economist. I love capitalism, but I like the old-fashioned kind where you do it with your own money. And this was an horrific setup at which they got to take the risks and earn the money, and the taxpayers picked up the pieces. And it was known in advance. In 2003, when I was the CBO director, we were telling the Congress, this is a dangerous thing, it's got to be changed. And you couldn't make any headway for exactly the reasons that the Secretary just described. I mean, it was an unbelievable political machine. And I will never forget leaving my post as CBO director and having Fannie Mae call me the next day and offer me a retainer for a research contract. I know what that is, and that was the problem.
What questions, comments? Oh, you're right.
Well, we're going to wait for the Twitter questions to come, but let's see, do we have some questions for our distinguished panel here? I know you do. Here you go. Number one. Hold on 1 second. Get the microphone and state your name and organization. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Before you start, thank you to our panelists. Okay. All right.
David Montes, representing Hispanos Unidos, and from Las Cruces.
Excellent.
Southern. Question, what are the real details? I know there's been a lot of talk about how ACORN and the community organizations affected, the pressuring the banks and the loans and sort of things. How much of a factor were they, as far as you guys know?
I can tell you, I sat initially on Texas Commerce Board and then J.P. Morgan Chase. They had a great deal of influence on the banks. They would picket the banks. In fact, sometimes they would picket the chairman, the CEO of the bank. And they had great support, in many cases, from the local leadership and the congressional leadership in that area. And they utilized it quite effective. It's important to note that many people did not understand how well they were being funded by Congress until all of this issue came to light. They've been funded that way for a long time. When I said something to President Bush about that he was a little surprised. He said, "We're funding." I said, "Yeah, we're funding them to bother us." I said, "Absolutely. That's what we're doing." So yes, it was very effective, and not so much, well, it was, but not like it was on those small, middle-sized banks. Right. Those banks suffered tremendously, especially those local banks.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, let's see. There
Can
were
I
a
add
couple
something
of
real
questions. Yes. Oh, okay, go ahead. Did I see somebody else here? Okay, go ahead. We have.
While we're waiting for that, let me make a comment, because we do have some opportunities coming up.
That's right.
What we can do is work with local community banks now. They're the ones more likely to be able to provide funding now for these mortgages. The big banks are the ones that took the big hits. They're scared to death. They don't want to do anything, even though they got a lot of money from the government. But the community banks were hardly really affected by it. I mean, some were, but for the most part, the smaller community banks are still in business of making loans, but they do it a lot on the regular credit basis of checking the creditor and checking the credit of the person, making sure they qualify. But they have a better chance now of making loans to the Latino market and the black community, because they are entrenched in the communities.
Excellent. Okay, question.
Yes, I'm sitting here just saddened about what I hear is going on in Washington, but my question is, why wouldn't you think outside the box, go outside of Washington? There are other law firms that Fannie Mae didn't have maybe throughout the United States that needed jobs and could do a good job for the government?
We did. That's why we brought Fannie Mae down. We got them. And I'll never forget the meeting with the lawyers and the person from the SEC. And at that time, the chairman was Franklin Rain. He was baffled. He was absolutely dazzled. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "This is the way we've always done it." And the guy from SEC said, "We're not going to do it anymore like that." And that's when the wall began to crumble.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, another question. The gentleman in there standing up.
My name is David Harris, and I just have one question. My understanding is that when Franklin Raines was testifying in Congress, he claimed it was his fiduciary requirement to maximize profits and therefore take on all of those risky loans. Is that not true?
First of all, let me say this to you. I love the way, and you almost paraphrased what he said, the risky loans. He didn't take on very many risky loans. Whether you believe it or not, Fannie Mae owned golf courses and clubhouses. They took tremendous risk with our money, but not necessarily, as Bob said, from low and moderate income people. After 2004, they did not meet any of the goals we set up at HUD for them to meet. And I must say, in many cases, when you try to make them meet those goals, and I don't say this lightly, one of the most powerful human beings sitting in Congress was Barney Frank. He would stand in the way. And believe me, you didn't want to get on his bad side, because whether you understand it or not, Congress funds each department, and they know how to hold your money up. So Franklin Raines, even though he said that, he did not. And let me read something to you, because I think it's important. It says that the trouble of GSEs that led to them being placed in conservatorship by the federal government provides strong testament that the GSEs were overexposed to undue risky mortgage investments that they created themselves. They were motivated by profit and market share. So what they did, and this is the best example I can give you, is they went and bought the risky loans from Washington Mutual. And they said, we're going to use these as our low and moderate income. Well, many of those loans were not made by banks that we had approved. Washington Mutual was making the loans. And so, in fact, when they bought them and Washington Mutual went under, of course they were. The second thing that was very important, they were dealing deeply in mortgage-backed securities. Look, when you talk about that's why AIG had so many problems. AIG was insuring mortgage-backed securities. And it's important to understand, you can't insure those. But they were insuring them. And can you imagine that 300 people in England brought down a corporation that size? Because they were in serious trouble once those mortgage-backed securities were called. And so when Franklin said he has a fiduciary duty, yeah, he did, but it sure wasn't carried out.
Something you said in your initial comments about the problem with all the papers that we have to sign. How do we better educate, whether it's minority communities or, goodness, just first-time home buyers, about the risks, about all the pitfalls and pratfalls? I noted that for native-born Hispanics were the hardest hit in the housing crisis, whereas first-time immigrant homeowners weren't so hard hit. What are we doing wrong in terms of educating folks who are born and educated here about how to become a property owner?
Well, first off, the difficulty in being able to read the documents, it is very difficult. I mean, we've bought properties recently, and I've had to go sit there, and the escrow officer was saying, "Why are you taking so long?" I said, "Because I'm reading every page." And I found a bunch of things in it. I said, "This is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong." And, but most people don't do that. Mm-hmm. I think the answer to that would be to create what we call a simplified disclosure that tells them in more common terms what it is that they're doing. I mean, they have to have the legalese and all the other papers, but the common language disclosure, and many attorneys are going to that now, they want to talk in terms of not legalese, but common terms, so that people can understand what's being said. And that's not an impossible task. I mean, geez, they put them in, require them to.
There are these one-pagers that are absolutely
Yeah,
perfect.
absolutely, and you can have a lot of disclosures in one page. And certainly don't put them in real small print because you can't read that. But there is a solution to it, and I think that would be one of the solutions.
But I think we also have to tell them, it's a lot like having kids, right? It's wonderful to have kids, but there's a better way to do it, right? You should, finish school, get a job, get married, then have kids. Don't get the order wrong. And, get a job, save some money, know what you're going to do with your life, then buy the house. And, we skipped those steps for a while.
Bob, let me say this to you, and then we can ask. When Mel Martinez was secretary and I was secretary, we did just what you said. It sat in Congress for 8 years. 8 years. It was never passed. And to date, it is still not passed. And they've submitted it again. This HUD has submitted it again. And I can assure you that even in their weakest form, Fannie and Freddie still has a great deal of influence.
Absolutely.
I'd like to say something too, what most people don't understand, which I think is absolutely unique but funny. The top lobbyist for Fannie was a very intelligent person, smart, and he did a great job of getting all the Congress people. Is now the National Security Advisor for President Obama.
Lovely. God help us.
Okay. We have one question from Twitter. We have quite a few, but I'm going to ask on behalf of Thomas Newhall. What are steps local communities can take to improve ownership rates? Now, this is local communities. Your best...
You said ownership rates?
Yeah, to increase the ownership rates for people to own a home, families around the
To have more
communities.
people buying homes and
Right.
owning homes? Well, that's tough because, it's the same thing. People want to buy a home. There are different ways to do it, and I would think now the market could do this and would be very helpful for people that are on the foreclosed homes or homes that are could be financed by the seller. And many of the banks now own property, so they could be the sellers. There is what they call a land transaction, where you actually buy the property, or you can rent with option to buy. And with that, you actually can ask the person who is renting it to you to apply part of the rent that you are paying and apply it to a down payment. So that over a period of time, many people, stay in a home 5 years or more, even though they're renting it. They could accumulate a substantial amount of money that's a portion of the rent, and then use it for a down payment. There are different ways it could be done, and banks should be able to do something like that. With all the money and assistance that the government has provided to banks, that's one way they could do it, and we could eliminate a lot of these foreclosed homes.
Well, I think certainly on the bank side, but I think, Doug, you struck on it a moment ago. You said if we are concerned about communities that aren't seeing home ownership rise, well, let's do the things to encourage job growth. Let's make sure that there's a growing, thriving economy so folks can afford to save and to buy and all those kind of things. That without a thriving economy, without a thriving job base, home ownership will become a tyranny rather than a benefit of a free society.
It all goes together because,
That's right.
the areas that were hit the hardest were areas that were doing a lot of home building. Right. And many of the Latinos, Hispanics who came to work in the United States that had some skills went into the housing industry. Mm-hmm. So in Nevada, they were, thousands and thousands of people that were working in the building industry. And then all of a sudden the market went down, the builders didn't build anymore, they're out of work. And so it's all tied into how do we get rid of the inventory that we have now so they can start building again so we can create jobs.
One tiny point.
One tiny point.
One tiny point. In every community, the most important decisions they make are zoning, land use rules. And there's a clear pattern of the bubble being exacerbated in those places that did not allow for expansion of the residential communities and had very tight zoning restrictions. And so you can control the cost of homeownership in your community to some extent, and they have to keep an eye on that.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question, way back in the back. Let's see. Is there, yeah, there's somebody with the, raising their hand.
Hi, I'm Debbie Hernandez, Rio Rancho Tea Party. And my question is, why can't we make the loan modification for people that are wanting to stay in their homes due to economic situation a little bit easier, to be able to have a loan modification instead of having a hard time, like myself, with Wells Fargo?
Okay. Anybody here from Wells Fargo?
Well, I think,
Okay,
I
go
think
ahead,
that it's,
Secretary.
let me qualify it this way. Having served as secretary, I'm convinced today that the government does not do very much well. We, before I left, put in place a program similar to that, and the present secretary has a program. But the moment you put it in, you must deal with the bureaucrats, and it never works like it should. It's a very difficult process. One of the things I found out when I was there is you might have great ideas, but unless you zone in on those ideas on a consistent basis, they never get done. And so what usually occurs is you have so many fires that you fight over here, over here, over there, you can't zero in, and that's done intentionally by the bureaucrats. So I would say to you, try to deal with the banks, even though the money has been allocated by the government to the banks, to the community banks. It's still going to be very, very difficult to get it because they work with HUD and other agencies, and they're not going to move very quickly, sadly to say. And lastly, what I'd like to say is this, is that many of the persons, Hispanics and blacks who made these loans, understand they wanted part of the American dream, and that's very important to me. But they were victimized in this process. And they were victimized not of themselves, they were victimized because many of the people in the government, HUD, before us, with us, after us, were not very vigilant in making sure that the mortgage industry did what they should be doing. And one of the conversations I had with both the black realtors and the Hispanic realtors, I asked them why would they be complicit in hurting their own people? But they, like anyone else, were caught up in greed. They wanted to make money.
That is, unfortunately, as painful as it is, that was the problem. Many Latinos, who did they buy the homes from? The agent was another Latino, was el compadre, was the neighbor. You know, many of us Latinos would do business with people who are our friends. And the banker was our friend, and our la comadre, you know. So regrettably, what we saw within the Hispanic community, it was our own people. They were everybody from the agent to the broker to the banker they were all Latinos, and many of them were hurting ourselves. So it's you know, I actually since I was Treasurer of the United States, I was there at the Hispanic Summit with the president, right. And we saw this vision of creating 5 million new homeowners in 8 years. And then when I was Secretary of State and Consumer Services Agency, I saw that because of the greed at all levels, because as Assemblymember Pacheco said, everybody wanted to take a little piece of the pie. And they were going to make more money if they sold a house for $400,000 than if they sold a house for $200,000. And everybody up above to Mr. Raines and people in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So it was just a greed that was very painful to watch. And it was very painful to watch so many of our families lose their home because they did not know what they were getting into. So, okay, next person, you are right here. And I think you're going to be the last person. Okay, microphone is coming.
My name is Hector Pimentel, Real Estate Services.
Thank you.
I've been a realtor for 12 years.
We are held to the highest standards with being a realtor. So it's kind of hard for me to take the statements that you've just said, basically saying that all the clients that I served in the past, it was out of greed, and it wasn't. It was to provide them with home ownership as well as to run a business, but it never at one point or time did I see myself or fellow realtors go, you know what, I'm gonna get rich off these people, so I'm gonna go ahead and put them in a bad situation. And I don't think that those are good statements, especially for people that are professional. They have ethical standards and work hard and try to stand strong within our community, and also politically reminding people how important it is to own a home. Because when you own a home, you're more likely to have a strong family that's gonna do well with their education, your kids will, and they'll have a bright future versus renters.
Right. You know what? And I think you bring up a really good point. And let me share with everybody that clearly there's a saying in Spanish, pagan justos por pecadores, right? The vast majority of people are really good people, and they mean well, and I'm sure you're one of them. But I know from experience, I hosted 18 foreclosure prevention workshops. Most of the people attending were Latinos. I heard the stories firsthand. I saw the paperwork firsthand. And as much as it was painful for me to understand that it was Latinos that did this. It wasn't you, and I'm not speaking about you and every other good, honest realtor, broker, agent. But overall, when I saw the numbers that I saw, when I talked to the people, and I would ask them if they wanted to, they could actually, we had the Department of Real Estate in California, they would be, if they were very willing, we could take them and have them complain. Do you know how many Latinos complained? Why? Because he was going to be their friend, because he had been their neighbor, because he was their comadre. So I understand, and I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, but I am telling you the reality that I lived in California. And as all of you know, California has been hit the hardest. So please, just like when we talk about teachers, we're not talking about the teachers, we're talking about the unions. There are some people that were bad apples out there. And unfortunately, they were really bad for the entire industry.
Let me say this to you, to the young man. I want you to deal with reality. You might be the most honest human being in the world. That's not reality for everybody that's in that business. And I can tell you the same as the treasurer just said. I went to more than 18. I went to about 60 or 70 with both blacks and Hispanics. And in 70, I would say 80% of the cases, their realtors were not white. Their realtors were the color that they were. And the realtors were living quite well because I can tell you when I spoke to the conference, they were doing quite well initially. So I am saying to you that I don't believe people necessarily in the business is bad or bad, but greed slips in, and you must control greed. If you were offended, I'd be the first to apologize, but I'm dealing with reality, what I saw.
Okay. Any other? Okay, the very last question, the person right here in front. That one.
Very quickly, my name is Paul Fredrickson. I work for a management company that manages HUD housing, HUD apartments. Anyway, when I bought a house, I don't think it's the realtor. I had a great realtor. I think it's the bankers that have caused more of this problem than the realtors themselves. The realtors are trying to find a home that will fit you, that you could fit in, but sometimes these bankers, oh yeah, we can do it, and then all of a sudden you're at a mortgage rate that's sky high, and you're just like, how am I going to do this?
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Well, I would say this to you, that having been secretary and traveled the country, there was complicit agreements with a lot of realtors and mortgage bankers, and they knew what they were doing. And I wish I could tell you something differently, because I was appalled, the same as the treasurer. It's easy to believe what you want to believe, but when you're put in the position to try to do something about it, you have a different perspective. And that's not to say that all people are bad. I'm just saying to you factually what happened. I have something my dad used to say all the time. I never question anybody's opinion, but unless they can give me facts differently, I do.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, because the comment that I made came actually from an interview with the president of the National Hispanic Realtors Association. And her comment was, yes, we did that. Some of our members did that.
Right.
So, I mean, that's coming from somebody that's associated directly with them. And it wasn't used to say so that you don't feel that you're the bad guy. You probably are one of the few that are good. But the point is, there are some that are not. And so unfortunately, that's human nature.
Yeah, but I think more importantly, I think that this has been a great lesson for all of us. I think it's been a great lesson for government, for bureaucracy. Certainly Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have learned a lot, you know, but for us and for our community. You know, instead of being discouraged,
Right.
I was the treasurer of the United States. A lot of people, I was very excited that we were going to get so many of our people into a new home. And now, you know, through the loss of so many of them, I could become discouraged, you know, but I'm not. There is a way, there is a better way. We need to educate our community. They need to be financially educated about how to get into these contracts. We need forms, and in California, and he was talking about that because in California, the governor did sign a law that said we need, in one sheet of paper, something that says very clear terms, people understand. You know, there are things that we can do. There are better ways. And ultimately, I do want to have those 5 million new homeowners again. And I think we will. You know, so this is painful. This was painful for all of us to go through it. But in the end, I think we have all learned. And if it helps our community in the future, then it was well worth the pain. Thank you so very much. Thank you, our panelists, for your insight. And before we break, let me just tell you that there is a lost digital camera out there. If somebody has one and doesn't know who it belongs to, please give it to me. I will give it to the right person. It's a lot easier. If you found it, don't take it home. It's somebody else's pictures there. Just give it to me, okay? We have a 15-minute break. We'll come back. There is a very important panel coming after this, so I expect to see all of you back. Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Sir.